In every science fiction saga, there is an event from which all reckoning begins, a foundation stone that alters the history of the universe and divides time into before and after. In the Dead Space universe, both the place where it happened and the moment when it occurred are known. It was the year 2214, at the Chicxulub crater. In that year, humanity signed its own death warrant when it discovered, deep within the crater, where the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs had fallen 65 million years earlier, the black marker. This story was told in Brian Evanson's Dead Space, Martyr. As you understand, there is no video footage for it, so today you'll have to rely on your imagination. Pretend you're listening to an audiobook. Let us descend together with Altman to the bottom of the Chicxulub crater and witness how it all began. The creature lunged at him, and he sprang aside. With a loud crack, it slammed into the curved wall of the room, leaving a deep dent behind. The monstrosity was twice his size. It moved impossibly fast, shifting its weight from its massive front limbs, covered in spiked chitinous armor, to its hind legs. Glancing around, the creature let out a terrible howl, filled with either rage or despair. All right, he thought. Now it was his turn. But the creature pressed forward. This time he did not leap away. Instead, he dove between its arms, sliding under its unprotected belly. Pulling out his knife, he slashed into the dead flesh, trying to cut as deep as possible, then scrambled back to his feet and stumbled toward the corner. But he did not get far. The monster twisted suddenly, grabbed his leg and hurled him like a ragdoll. Then it lifted him into the air and roared, shook him violently, and tore him in half. Chava awoke before dawn. His mother and sister were still sleeping peacefully, but he knew why he had awakened. Something had wandered through his dreams, something that moved in spasms, twitching like a broken puppet, staring at him with dead eyes. He dressed and stepped out of the hut. The air carried the heavy scent of salty dampness. Then he heard voices, a whisper, quiet, sticky, as though coming through water. He could not understand the words, but he felt them. They seeped into him, leaving traces inside. He shook his head, but the voices did not vanish. They merely hid. Chava walked along the waterline when he saw something washed ashore. Not a fish, not a person. He came closer to look at the creature. The thing looked like a nightmare from his dream, but worse, much worse. Its neck seemed as though the skin had been stripped away, revealing a reddish core dotted with pale, oozing sores. What might have been eyes were only hollow sockets, veiled by pulsing veins and a thick membrane. Its jaw seemed entirely gone, replaced by a fold of shriveled skin and a hole where its mouth should have been. The creature was hunched, its fingers fused together, a thin, leathery membrane stretching from its elbow to its thigh like a bat's wing. It tried to rise but collapsed again into the wet sand. Two swollen masses bulged from its back, still growing. Chava thought that a prayer to the Holy Mother might have crossed his mind, though it came out only as a stunned whisper inside him. The creature made a sound like a groan, its back pulsating with the swelling lumps. It hacked up a milky fluid that hung in strands from the opening on its face. Then its back split open with a sharp, agonizing crack, spraying blood and revealing spongy gray sacs that inflated and deflated in ragged rhythm. Chava could not move. The creature suddenly turned its head toward him, looking at him with its eyeless face. The muscles in its face tightened, and the gaping hole twisted into something like a smile. The boy turned and ran. Chava brought the entire village to see the strange creature. People were confused, and only one word echoed everywhere: Ixtab. An old witch explained that Ixtab was a goddess, a hanged woman, the deity of suicide who gathered to herself those who had died in questionable ways. The witch performed a strange ritual and burned the creature. Stripped of its flesh and reduced to ashes, it looked almost human. Later, Chava found the witch in her own hut, with her throat slit. It was clear she had been dead for several hours and could not possibly have carried out any ritual 15 minutes earlier. This lay beyond the boy's understanding, and he decided not to think about it. Michael Altman rubbed his eyes tiredly, pulling himself away from the screen. He had been sleeping poorly. The data on the holographic display clearly indicated that he was dealing with something anomalous. Geophysicists were discussing what had happened in the Chicxulub crater. Only one thing was clear. Something had changed, something had gone wrong, yet no one knew what had caused it, or what consequences it might bring. No one had ever seen anything like it. Field said he would send the report file to the central office and wait for their recommendations. Altman chose to act on his own. He called every scientist he knew, combed through documents, but found nothing. It was certainly a gravitational anomaly. Something had also shifted in the electromagnetic field, though anything beyond that was difficult to determine. A phone call pulled him out of his thoughts. A strange voice arranged a meeting with him in a secluded place, saying the conversation would concern the crater itself. Altman decided not to go, assuming it was someone's stupid joke. At home, Ada was waiting for him. She had fallen asleep at the table, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders. He woke her with a kiss on the neck. She told him he was late and tried to smile, but there was worry in her eyes. She spoke of the nightmares that had tormented her during the night. He had slept badly as well. He whispered that something was wrong and told her about the strange things that had been happening. The anomaly, the phone calls, the feeling that everyone around them was hiding something. Ada replied that she felt it too, that the old folk tales were changing. People kept talking about the devil's tail, she said, and she crossed her fingers as she mentioned it. But whenever she asked for details, they fell silent. The most unsettling thing, she added, was that in the Mayan language, this name sounded exactly like Chicxulub. When Altman asked if that was not the name of the crater, she answered that it was. His throat went dry. He glanced at the clock. He could still make the meeting. The stranger approached him on his own, a bony man in a paratrooper's uniform. He asked if he was Altman, and when Altman confirmed it, the man introduced himself as Charles Hammond. Hammond worked in communications. He had noticed a signal, faint, irregular, coming from the Chicxulub crater. Altman asked whether he had told anyone. Hammond replied that he had not, that Dredgercorp, the company he worked for, had made him sign papers, given him money, and ordered him to keep silent. When Altman asked why, Hammond said it was because there was something down there. Altman then told Hammond what Ada had heard. He concluded that there were 3 separate chains of evidence, and all of them led back to the Chicxulub crater. Hammond took out a holopod and showed him an image, explaining that there was something on the bottom of the crater, something important. He had managed to intercept numerous conversations about it from the communications stream, but after 3 days, all the messages had become encrypted. The image looked like the shape Ada had made with her crossed fingers, the same symbol the settlers were now making. Altman thought of it as the devil's tail. Hammond said that Dredgercorp, or whoever stood behind it, had found this object in the crater and believed it was not of human origin. Altman froze at the implication and asked if he meant it was alien. Hammond said he did not know, but that the impulse itself felt like a signal. Within a few hours of that conversation, Hammond was dead. William Tanner was the head of the newly founded, semi-secret Dredgercorp Chicxulub division, established as soon as data began to suggest that something was happening at the crater's entrance. Together with the colonel, he studied Altman's photograph, trying to determine how dangerous the man might be. Only one thing was clear to them: they needed to reach the crater first. For this mission, Tanner took Dante with him, a former soldier from his own unit who could think quickly and felt no pangs of conscience. The second crew member was Hennessy, a marine geologist with limited experience as a submariner. A few phone calls later, the newest submarine, the F-7, was already waiting for them under a tarp on the deck of a cargo ship 15 miles from the crater entrance. The F-7 turned out to be a bathyscaphe, a prototype drilling platform designed to descend to extreme depths and bore through solid rock. Once everything was prepared, an immediate order was given to descend to the crater floor. For many days, William Tanner had wondered what could be down there, how something seemingly man-made could be buried beneath solid stone at the bottom of the crater, or whether it had not been made by humans at all, and whether he was standing on the threshold of first contact with intelligent life beyond Earth. That night, one of the crew members, Hennessy, slept poorly. He dreamt of something, and a horrifying voice kept whispering his name. Suddenly, in the dream, the thing began to change. It solidified, took shape, and started gaining vague detail. It was a tightly packed mass of dead bodies, wedged into one another, flowing in and out of each other. He wanted to close his eyes but couldn't. There were thousands of them, perhaps more, and their faces grew clearer and clearer until he realized he knew every one of them, all of them dead. He was torn from the dream by the bruises sent to bring him to the F-7. Hennessy had barely regained his senses when the speedboat delivered him to the bathyscaphe. They hit the water, and darkness became absolute. The external lights came on, controls were checked, microphones and sonar adjusted. Everything seemed in order. At first they descended slowly, then a little faster. They sank deeper and deeper, moving through a dark, monotonous world. Suddenly, Hennessy realized it was exactly like his dream, and unease crawled through him. All they needed was to push farther, drill as quickly as possible toward the object, collect a small sample as Tanner had requested, and immediately return to the surface. Hennessy heard a voice whispering his name, the same voice from the dream. A wave of pain tore through his skull. He growled, pressing his fingers harder against his temples, and glanced at Dante to see whether he had noticed anything. He saw Dante clutching his own head, pale and sweating, his face twisted in a grimace, but after a minute he steadied himself and pretended nothing had happened. The bottom appeared below them, smooth and flat. After reporting their arrival, they began drilling. At first it was just silt and sediment, filtered down over many years. Digging through it was easy, but progress was slow because the drill had nothing solid to grip. Suddenly the drill halted, and the oxygen regulator died. The lights flickered, and the instrument readings collapsed into static lines. Even the emergency lights failed. For an instant he heard Tanner's voice crackle in the speakers, then only dead silence. Then everything became far worse. On the other side of the viewport, a faintly illuminated face appeared. It was outside, pressed between the glass and the wall of the tunnel they had just drilled, glowing softly. It was his brother, Shane. His brother, who had died many years ago. Hennessy asked him what he was doing there. Shane, looking shyly downward, said he had hoped Hennessy would let him in. Hennessy looked around in the darkness, trying to picture the layout of the cabin. He told Shane there wasn't much space, and he wasn't sure there would be room. Shane told him to trust him, that there was more than enough space, and that if Hennessy let him in, he would see. Hennessy agreed. The moment he did, the lamps flickered and came fully alive. The instruments rebooted. Hennessy heard static in his ear and saw Tanner's image return on the holoscreen where only interference had been before. The oxygen regulators resumed their hum. The drill roared back to life. Hennessy knew everything would be fine now. His brother, good old Shane, was sitting beside him in a chair that hadn't seemed to be there earlier. He was smiling, holding Hennessy's hand in his own. Now that Shane was here, everything would work. The bathyscaphe moved slowly forward until it struck something that made the drill howl. Dante tried several more times, but the drill kept slamming into something solid. Hennessy asked what it was. Shane answered that it was the black marker. As soon as the water settled, he began examining it more closely. It appeared to be a monolith made of some form of obsidian. It tapered toward the top, spiraling along its entire height. It was covered in horizontal grooves and thousands of symbols unlike anything he had ever seen before. He could not tell whether they glowed on their own, or whether it only seemed that way because of the glare from the floodlights. The portion he could see stood about 3 meters tall. Dante kept moving closer to the marker and refused to listen to any warnings. Shane told Hennessy that Dante had become one of them, and that they would have to deal with him. The monolith terrified Dante to the point of panic. Geological data suggested it had been here for more than 50 million years. That meant it predated humanity, yet it was unmistakably crafted, either by humans or by another intelligent form of life. It was beyond comprehension. Dante inspected the molecular cutters, capable of shaving off a thin layer of the material. Carefully, he extended the arm until it reached the marker's surface, then pushed it forward and began to cut. Almost immediately, a piercing pain filled his head, so intense he felt himself slipping toward unconsciousness. All they needed was a small fragment, just a tiny piece, and then he could turn the F7 around and get the hell out of there. Shane said he should not be doing this. Shane's mouth opened silently in the water like that of a fish pulled from the sea. He claimed that merely looking was bad enough, but touching it was far too much, and that none of them should have done it. Shane continued, saying this was not something meant to be studied, that it must be left where it had lain undisturbed for millions of years. He asked whether they truly believed it had been buried so deeply if it was ever meant to be found. It simply needed to remain here. They had to resist the convergence. Hennessy suddenly began screaming uncontrollably. It was clear he had completely lost his mind. He shouted something about his dead brother being there with them, shrieked that the thing must not be touched. Dante said he was already shutting everything down, but he never finished the sentence. Hennessy drove a metal rod into him. the one he had earlier pulled from the oxygen recycler. Then he stabbed him again, and again. Dante lay on the floor, feeling life drain from him, and suddenly sensed that people were crowding around. He began to recognize faces. They were all the men he had killed during the lunar mission when he stole their oxygen to survive. Hennessy kept beating him with the rod until Dante was dead. Hennessy stared at the mangled remains on the floor, unable to believe he had done this to Dante. Shane told him that it was the right thing, that he had acted correctly. The marker belonged to the past, and the past had to remain untouched if they wished to stay themselves. He said Hennessy had already awakened it, and that it was calling to him even now. But he must not obey. He must not listen. Shane urged him to tell the others, to tell everyone. Hennessy was alone. Blood was everywhere, along with shattered debris and Dante's corpse. The marker pulsed beyond the viewport, calling to him. Shane kept telling him not to touch it, not to try to understand it, but Hennessy wanted to understand. The voice in his head grew stronger. Light filled his skull, scorching away his thoughts. He needed to record it, urgently, but there was no paper. So he dipped his fingers into Dante's blood and began writing on the walls. Inverted letters, circles, symbols. They poured out of him, coating the walls and the control panels in a thick, viscous script. He tore Dante apart, squeezing out the last drops of the precious fluid. Then he remembered that blood was within him as well. Using the sharp rod, he slit his own veins and covered his bare skin in symbols. Hennessy felt like the marker itself. He felt beautiful, covered in a swarm of characters that held the knowledge of the universe written across his body. He stood upright, arms hanging at his sides, silent and still. He was the marker. He felt its power flowing through him. Then he activated the transmitter and screamed into the camera that they had misunderstood everything. The oxygen ran out. He collapsed onto the floor, curling into a trembling knot. Shortly afterward, he died, and the marker continued to exist. Tanner had gone 48 hours without sleep, unsuccessfully trying to reach the F7 bathyscaphe, lost somewhere in the black abyss. Only scraps of signals came through, flickering like the last sparks of sanity in the dark. And then there was this, an image torn out of the static, a dismembered body carefully arranged in a chair, a few strands of hair matted into a bloody slurry, the only thing hinting that this heap of flesh had once been the man called Dante. Hennessy was gone. Something had happened down there, at the marker. Tanner wanted to warn the colonel before showing him the recording, but the colonel merely waved him off. The transmission was ragged, full of interference that hissed and scratched at the ears. On the screen was a man, Hennessy. His skin was covered in blood-written markings and incomprehensible symbols. Judging by the gash on his arm, the blood was his own. He was muttering something, but the noise and static made it impossible to distinguish a single word, as if he were speaking with a mouthful of bees. The colonel asked how many people had seen the transmission. Tanner explained that 3 or 4 technicians had viewed it, but since it had been a broadcast, many more might have caught different fragments. There was no way to know who had seen what. The colonel then asked whether killing the technicians would be pointless in that case. He told Tanner not to misunderstand him. This was far more important than the man realized, far more important than 1 or 2 lives. There were billions of people on Earth. Humans were expendable. But this, whatever it was something they had never encountered before. He ordered Tanner to find out exactly how many people might have seen the video. Altman watched the graph spike again. Too sharp, too clean to be a natural phenomenon. The other scientists had noticed it as well. Showalter had recorded the same surge at 6:38 in the morning. Ramirez had discovered a cargo ship carrying a high-end modern submersible and heavy security that looked like a squad of Spec Ops enforcers. SCAD had found a strange rhythm in the seismic data. Not an earthquake, but drilling. Somewhere near the center of the crater. There was no certainty that the impulse, the cargo vessel, and the seismic pattern were connected, but they all pointed to the same place, the center of the crater. Something was happening down there. That night, Michael Altman woke to the feeling of his phone vibrating on the bedside table. It rang, trembled, fell silent. The number was blocked, the hologram disabled. The third call woke Ada. She asked whether he was going to answer it. He did. The voice that spoke was unfamiliar. The caller asked if he was Michael Altman and wanted to know whether he had seen anything unusual, whether he had intercepted anything. Altman asked what exactly the caller meant, whether he was talking about the signal, and suggested that if the man shared what he knew, they might be able to help each other. The voice sounded hurried but unwilling to reveal anything. He said he had expected more from Altman, then disappeared. Ada asked who it had been, and Altman told her he had no idea, though he wished he knew. Sleep would not return. Michael rose and washed his face. For days he had been plagued by nightmares and headaches. He turned on his computer, leaned over the keyboard, and typed a message. Midnight call. Asked whether I'd seen anything strange. Seemed to mean the signal from the crater. Once I hinted at it, the call dropped. Has anyone else had anything like this happen? In the morning, logging into the system, he found that the others had received the same call. Ramirez first, then Scad, and Showalter. Bennett, a geologist and amateur radio operator, said the caller had spoken about a video transmission. He claimed he had understood that immediately, that the mysterious caller had been probing for information without revealing what he wanted. Bennett added that he had intercepted a small fragment of the transmission and asked if Altman wanted to see it. Altman told him to send a copy and asked whether Bennett knew where the broadcast had originated. Bennett said it had come from somewhere near the crater's center, and Altman heard the incoming file tone. It was a disturbing piece of footage. A naked man, his body covered in symbols drawn with something that resembled blood, staring into the camera with a strange grin. Something had clearly happened at the very heart of the crater, and someone, likely Dredgercorp, or perhaps someone else altogether, was very, very interested enough to conduct illegal drilling operations in order to uncover whatever lay at the bottom. This could also explain the video fragment, Altman realized. What if the broadcast had come from a submarine? That same day, Altman sat in the hotel lobby at an old terminal built before holographic displays became standard. He transferred the video from his holopod to the terminal, spent some time ensuring he had left no digital traces, created a false account, and began distributing the file. He titled the message Dredgercorp's Illegal Operations in Chicxulub and attached the video with a note. The last words from a submarine at the bottom of the Chicxulub crater. After a moment of thought, he added, "Mission failed." Then he sent the message to every scientific staff member in Chicxulub he knew, including himself and several outside contacts. That should get their attention, he thought. That evening he told Ada everything. The strange signals rising from beneath the water, the secret submarines, the footage of a madman who had covered himself in blood-drawn symbols. He expected her to laugh, to call him paranoid, but Ada did not laugh. She told him quietly that he was an idiot, that this could be dangerous, that he was digging into things he was never meant to know. Protected sites, hidden expeditions, signals rising out of the abyss. None of this was a joke. She said she was sure the people searching for the source of that signal would not be pleased with his attention. She added that he was not the only one who had noticed something. It had all begun with the pulses inside the crater. Then came the nightmares and the headaches. Not just for him, for her as well, and for everyone else. She had asked people about it, and they all said the same thing. Nightmares. Nightmares that were frightening, bloody, apocalyptic. Ada had spent a long time studying local legends and the rituals of the indigenous population. But ever since the mysterious pulsing began, the villagers had been seeing identical dreams of the Devil's Tail, a name tied directly to the Chicxulub crater. Wherever she looked, she found the same strange symbol, two interwoven horns. The locals told her it was connected to the devil, buried deep at the center of the earth, who had left only his tail on the surface. The legends claimed that anyone who touched the devil's tail risked attracting his attention and then being taken by him. She told Michael she had spoken to a local drunk who knew many of the old stories. He had said that she and her people had already revealed themselves to the devil. He had pointed at her then, marking her with a strange gesture, a kind of curse, crossing the index and middle fingers. After that, he had refused to speak further. She told Michael she was frightened. Tanner reported to the colonel that they had found about a dozen witnesses to the transmissions, though half of them had seen only static. In response, the colonel showed him a message from someone calling themselves Watchdog. The video of the final words from the submarine at the bottom of the Chicxulub crater had been released publicly. The footage showed Hennessy, covered in blood, smiling in a terrifying way. The colonel said it was already too late to hide anything. The plan would have to change, not to conceal the truth, but to seize control of the narrative. he ordered a press conference to be organized, where they would show the available material and tell the so-called truth. In a carefully crafted interpretation, the official version would be that Hennessy had gone insane while testing an experimental bathysphere on the crater floor. The intent was to present the entire incident as a scientific project marred by a tragic accident, to minimize the damage and retain control of the situation. Then, the colonel said, Tanner would turn to the military, and here the colonel pointed to himself, and request assistance in retrieving the bathysphere, promising that the press would be informed of everything that had occurred inside during those final, fatal hours. The next day, Altman had barely started working when someone knocked on the laboratory door. 2 police officers entered. They had questions about Charles Hammond. One of the officers explained that Altman had been the last person to see Hammond alive. Shortly afterward, Hammond had slit his own throat. They knew the 2 men had met in a bar, and they wanted to know what they had talked about. Michael took a deep breath and carefully recounted their entire conversation. When he mentioned the name Dredgercorp, he noticed the officers exchange a glance. They told him they would contact him if they needed anything further, and then they left. After the unsettling visit, Altman returned to his work, only to immediately see the latest news. A representative of Dredgercorp was presenting the very same video Altman had sent to his colleagues, commenting on it with full confidence. The official explanation was smooth and plausible, too smooth to be true. When Michael came home, he did not find Ada there, and immediately grew anxious. After the news of Hammond's death, the certainty that he and those close to him might be in danger had only strengthened. But soon Ada appeared, and she was not alone. She was holding a young boy by the hand. She introduced him as Chava. The boy was barefoot, wearing a worn-out t-shirt and a pair of shorts that barely stayed on him. His eyes were dark brown, and his expression carried a faint trace of fear. Ada told Michael that Chava had told her something very interesting, and she had invited him for dinner in the hope that he would share the story with Michael as well. After a hearty meal, the boy began his tale. He said that very early in the morning he had been walking along the shore. It was the day he had been considering going down the beach and then heading into town to earn some money as a courier. But on that day, his legs had decided to take a different path. He said he could not stop them. So instead of heading toward the city, they had carried him farther and farther along the beach. And then he found something. It had looked like a person, but it was not a person. It had looked like an inflatable balloon, but it was not a balloon. The witch had told him to burn it, because it was a flea from the devil's tail. As he spoke, he crossed his index and middle finger and raised his hand so they could see. He said that later he learned the witch had already been dead for some time. Altman asked how she could have spoken to him if she had been dead. The boy did not answer. Altman then asked whether he had burned the thing. The boy said he had, and that it had burned very well. Michael asked him if he could take them to the place where he had found it. Chava nodded. Tanner had finally reached a comfortable bed with a glass of whiskey, for the first time in what felt like ages. He told himself it was all behind him now, that it was time to relax. His phone rang. An unfamiliar voice demanded sharp answers about Hennessy's death and the failure of the security system. Tanner rejected the call twice and eventually switched the phone off. He took another sip of whiskey, felt the sleeping pill begin to take hold, and drifted into unconsciousness. Then, a ring. On the screen was the name of the dead man, Dante. Tanner nearly fainted. The phone was turned off, and yet it continued to ring. A familiar voice asked from behind him whether he was going to answer it, and the hair on the back of Tanner's neck stood on end. Very slowly he turned. In the bed beside him, a blurry shape was forming, slowly taking the outline of a human figure. Crude, unnatural features sharpened bit by bit until Dante appeared. His skin was extremely pale, almost bloodless, and his lips had a bluish tint. Dante said he needed help. Tanner readily agreed, saying he would do anything. Dante told him it was hard for him to breathe, that Tanner needed to share oxygen with him. He said all Tanner had to do was make a long, narrow incision in his breathing tube, that he would make a similar cut in his own, and then they could join them so both could breathe. Tanner began to say he didn't have a breathing tube, but then reached toward his throat and felt it. It was there. He took a knife from the bedside drawer and asked where he should make the cut. Dante replied that it did not matter, as long as it was long enough. Tanner made a long horizontal incision. He said it was done, though his voice sounded wrong, Something was off with his vocal cords. He began to cough, spitting blood. The blanket in front of him appeared to be flecked with red droplets. He looked down and saw blood running in streams down his chest. He heard Dante's voice, now drifting away, saying he should have left it where it had been safe, that he should never have tried to understand it. Oxygen continued to hiss out. Tanner tried to press his hand over the tear, but it was too large. All he could do was rise and step toward the mirror to get a good look at himself, to try to understand where exactly he had gone wrong. Despite the darkness, Chava walked forward with confidence, explaining that the witch, though already dead, had helped them and told them what to do. Altman struggled to follow the boy's logic, but then Chava abruptly pointed ahead. There they found the remains of a fire, and among the coals lay strangely twisted bones and a toothless skull. It resembled a human skeleton, yet looked disturbingly unnatural. Neither Michael nor Ada understood what it meant, and the local villagers were in no hurry to tell them what had happened. On the way back, Michael told Ada about Hammond's death, which alarmed her greatly. They decided to stop for a drink. With 2 bottles of beer, they sat on a low wall outside. He said it all worried him. The events in Chicxulub, the impulse, the submarine, the stories Ada had heard, the nightmares everyone was experiencing, the remains they had seen on the beach. And he told her he believed they were in trouble, not just the 2 of them, but everyone. When he wondered aloud where his bottle had gone, he turned on his flashlight and saw a drunk nearby, happily drinking the stolen beer. The man finished it, tossed the bottle aside, pointed at Ada, and beckoned. Ada handed him her own beer and told him they had met before, that he had told her his stories, but he did not answer. After a long pause, he leaned against the wall, closed his eyes, and suddenly asked in Spanish for their names. Michael introduced himself and Ada, but the man ignored the question and instead thanked them for the drink with exaggerated politeness. He said Michael bore the name of the Archangel and asked whether he was religious. Michael said he was not. The drunk replied that he could see in Michael's face that he was one of them, and claimed the devil believed he knew Michael, though he did not know him completely. Michael admitted his mother had been part native, though he did not know from which tribe, and the man told him he would say it was their tribe. He added that if they bought him more to drink, he would tell them everything he knew about what Michael had been asking the entire settlement, the devil's tale, and he crossed his fingers as he said it. The drink was bought immediately, and the man began. He said they lived on the edge of the region where the devil had dug a path into hell, leaving only his tail behind. Perhaps, he said, they did not believe it was true, but he insisted that Michael, Ada, and the rest of the Yucatan Maya had been called to watch the devil and drive him back into hell whenever he appeared. The body burned on the beach had not been the only one. His father had told him of others, though he had never seen them himself. Perhaps his great-great-grandfather had. When the appointed hour struck, the devil's tail awakened, sending its curse to wash the dead onto their shores and into their minds. They destroyed the messengers on the beaches and appealed to those within their heads to lull the tale back into slumber, for they were not ready to listen to it. He claimed he had seen the creature with his own eyes, human-like, but not human, and that there were rituals tied to the appearance of the devil or his servants, the so-called paths of banishment. This time, he said, the one who had led them had been a boy who barely understood what he was doing. There was one detail he had noticed about the creature, the reason he had not been able to bring himself to dance the ritual with the others. Where a human arm should have been, he had seen a tattoo. It was a tattoo he had seen before, weeks earlier in a bar, on the arm of a sailor sitting beside him. Drunk, the sailor had shown him an image of a woman riding a wave and holding the sun cupped in her hands. The next day the sailor had left the town by ship, and later, that same tattoo had appeared on the creature they had burned on the beach. Lenny Small, the president of Dredger Corp, was still asleep when the video link activated, and Craig Markoff from the Government Intelligence Service informed him of Tanner's suicide. Markoff told him he had prepared a statement, a list of things Small could and could not say regarding Tanner's death. Then Markoff added one more thing. The pulse signal had stopped. Small asked what that meant, and how they were supposed to proceed now. Markoff told him that the gravitational anomaly was still present, that the object was still in place, but that it had simply ceased transmitting. They would continue as planned, he said. The towing of the station to the work site was already underway. A slow process, but it would arrive. They could begin the submarine recovery operation and at the same time take steps to prepare the object for extraction. Small asked whether the profits were still to be divided evenly. Markov said they were, though profit was hardly the primary goal. 6 months from now, he claimed, the two of them might well become the most influential men in the world. Showalter, Ramirez, Scad, and Altman decided to discuss the sudden disappearance of the pulse in a bar. Altman said the anomaly was still present, but the signal had stopped, and they did not know whether it was permanent or temporary, nor why it had ceased. The question, he told them, was whether they should move forward now that the signal was gone. The other three stared at him. Showalter asked what he meant by "move forward." Altman explained that until now they had been conducting their investigation quietly, without attracting attention. Now Dredgercorp was pushing toward the center of the crater under the pretense of rescuing the submarine, and once there, they would undoubtedly examine whatever lay buried at the crater's heart. Ramirez asked how Altman proposed they proceed. Altman said they would prepare a thorough and well-supported plan for investigating the crater and submit it to the scientific foundation, pointing out the gravitational anomaly and the pulse signal, and perhaps even mentioning the submarine transmission. They would call for a publicly funded excavation of the Chicxulub crater. Showalter asked what they would do if the foundation refused. Altman said then they would appeal to as many organizations as possible, seek independent funding, and ensure that as many people as possible learned about the pulse and the anomaly. Someone, he said, would eventually begin questioning Dredgercorp's motives. At the very least, it would force them to operate on a shorter leash. The other three scientists agreed. Altman told them it was time to get to work. He slept, and again he dreamed nightmares. He was running, and something was chasing him. Something with strange appendages instead of arms, shaped like tusks, and horns sprouting from the joints of its limbs. Its body looked as if the skin had been torn off. The lower part of its face was splitting apart in chunks. Its eyes burned with a yellow glow. He fired at the creature several times. Even after losing its legs, the moaning thing continued to advance, dragging itself forward by digging the sharp tips of its tusks into the ground. He shot off its arms, then its head, and finally it stopped. He was about to leave when he heard something behind him. With a wet, sliding sound, the creature grew new arms and legs. It rose, roared, and lunged at him again. Screaming, he fled. A man beside his bed then asked if he was having nightmares. He was a large man with a square jaw and white hair, dressed in the dark uniform of military intelligence, looking at Altman with a cold, distant stare. On either side of him stood two big men who looked like twins. Altman asked where he was. The man told him he was home. Altman asked where Ada was, and the man said his girlfriend was not there, that she was with them and would remain with them for a while, and that she was safe. When Altman demanded to know what they were doing there and started to get up, the man raised a finger, and calmly but firmly the twins held Altman by the arms and pushed him back onto the bed. The man introduced himself as Craig Markov and said he had come because Altman had filed a grant proposal to investigate the Chicxulub crater. Altman argued that there was nothing wrong with that. It was what scientists did. Markov told him the proposal had been removed from the general pool of grant applications and was now classified, and that the investigation of the crater was in military hands. Altman said that meant he had been right, that they were trying to obtain whatever lay inside the crater. Markov called him a clever man and explained he was there to determine how much Altman knew and whether he could become a useful member of their team. If he could, Markov would allow him to join. If not, he would find something else to do with him. When Altman asked what something else meant, Markov only shrugged and continued questioning him about how he had first realized something unusual was happening in the crater. Altman said he had discovered the gravitational anomaly. Markov asked whether it had not been the pulse signal, but Altman shook his head, saying he had learned about the pulse later. Markov asked who had told him, and Altman replied that it had been Charles Hammond. He added that he believed something was at the center of the crater, not a natural phenomenon, but something else, something that must have been there for a very long time, perhaps thousands of years, or even more. Markov asked why he believed that, and Altman explained that the Yucatan Maya had mythology tied to it, that they called it the Devil's Tail. He noticed something flicker in Markov's eyes. Markov told him he had revealed something he had not known before, and asked how Altman had learned it. Altman said he would give more details if Markov allowed him onto the project. He said he believed the object had been buried in the crater since the moment of its formation, thousands or even millions of years ago. What if, he suggested, it had not been the asteroid that created the crater, but the object itself striking Earth? That would mean it had been sent here by intelligent life outside their galaxy. Markov said that raised the question of why it transmitted signals, and Altman added the question of who transmitted them and what. Markov sighed, drew a pistol, and said he had to decide whether to kill Altman or take him along. Altman, his voice trembling, said he preferred to be taken, and added that the locals had found something, a strange humanoid creature that was not human, which they claimed was connected to what was happening in the crater. They had burned it, but its remains were still there for study, and Altman said he could show them. Markov asked if that was everything. Altman swallowed and said yes. Markov told him goodbye, raised the gun, aimed it at Altman's head, and pulled the trigger. Altman clenched his teeth and shut his eyes. He heard the click of the hammer, but no shot. He opened his eyes. Markov was staring at him. Markov said that laughter prolongs life, that the pistol was not loaded, and that he had never intended to shoot him. Then he welcomed Altman to the team. The enforcers stood beside Altman while he packed his things, urging him along from time to time. They confiscated his phone, his holopod, and even his terminal. He asked if he could at least call his family and workplace to say he would be gone, and they told him no. He asked whether they planned to kill him afterward, the way they had killed Hammond. One of the men grimaced and said Altman's suspicions were insulting, that he had indeed witnessed Hammond's death, but had had nothing to do with it. When Altman asked what had happened, the man said they had only been trying to interrogate Hammond when he suddenly snapped. He had never seen anything like it, and Hammond had seized a knife and cut his own throat, an image that had since returned to him constantly in nightmares. When Michael was ready, they went to the Dredger Corp building, where a helicopter waited on a concrete pad, and Altman climbed aboard. Ada was there. He sat beside her, and she pressed close to him. Looking around the helicopter, he saw 8 other scientists inside. His colleague Field was among them, as were Scad and Showalter. The helicopter began to descend, and through an engineered bank of fog emerged a massive floating complex, over 100 meters in diameter, built from a series of glass and plastic domes. Much of the structure lay below the waterline. For every meter it rose above the surface, another seemed buried beneath it. Altman only truly grasped its scale once they were inside, descending 15 to 20 meters downward. Here and there stood people in white coats directing groups of soldiers hauling equipment. Partway down a corridor, Altman noticed that the wall of the tunnel was washed by rising water, the level climbing gradually with each step. Eventually they reached a space resembling a command bridge. A chair rotated, revealing Markov. He looked at the newcomers and smiled without warmth, telling them they had arrived and welcoming them to their new home. It took some time, but eventually they grew accustomed to their new living quarters. Altman had never seen a finer laboratory in his life. There were still 3 weeks to go before they would reach the center of the Chicxulub crater. The floating complex moved very slowly and sometimes stopped altogether, depending on weather conditions. As Altman got to know the others, he had to admit that Markov had assembled a top-tier team. Without knowing exactly what kind of object might lie inside the crater, he had prepared for every possible outcome. Geophysicists and astrophysicists, robotics experts, geologists, marine biologists, geneticists, oceanologists, engineers of every sort, a mining specialist, an oceanographer, a seismologist, a volcanologist, a gravitologist, a philosopher, a cognitive scientist, various physicians, a medic specializing in barotrauma and decompression injuries, numerous mechanics and technicians, as well as administrative, maintenance, and kitchen personnel. There was even a linguist and an anthropologist, Ada. What unsettled Altman was the number of military guards and the intensity of their training. He saw 3 possible explanations. Either Markov was a soldier at heart, or he expected an attack from competitors, or, most frightening of all, he believed the object in the crater might resist. On the 2nd or 3rd day in the cafeteria, a sturdy, red-bearded man named Jason Hendricks sat down beside Altman. They introduced themselves and talked. Hendricks explained that he had once been a submarine pilot and now operated the bathyscaphe. Later he offered Altman the position of his second pilot. Altman agreed. The idea excited him. He learned to operate the craft quickly and was glad to have found something in which he could be truly useful. They were still far from the center of the crater, but Markov decided to conduct deep water tests of the bathyscaphes. Hendricks and Altman began their descent, constantly checking their actions against the manual. They dropped to 1,000 meters and waited for Markov to authorize a further descent. When the order came, they continued down to 2,000 meters and repeated the procedure. Altman remarked that it was fairly simple, and Hendricks shrugged, saying it was more or less so, the only real problem being that below this depth, the quality of communication would deteriorate, making it hard to predict whether the team above would receive the data they transmitted. Hendricks then asked whether Altman had heard the stories about the other bathyscaphe. Altman said he had seen the video. Hendricks asked what he thought had happened down there, and Altman brushed the question aside, saying he did not know. Hendricks told him to relax, that there was no point rushing anything, and added that if he understood the data correctly, the signal seemed to be rising again, something they could verify next time. For now, he had orders to bring them back. The security team was waiting when they opened the hatch and stepped onto the deck. Markov asked whether the signal had resumed, and if they were certain. Hendricks replied that the instruments did not lie. Markov asked whether either of them felt anything unusual or strange. Altman shook his head and said no. Hendricks said he was unsure, that when they reached 2,000 meters, he had felt some kind of premonition. Markov called for Stevens, and one of the researchers stepped forward. He told him to take Hendricks and run a full spectrum of psychological tests, and said that if he detected even the slightest hint of a problem, he had full authority to pull Hendricks from duty. If he was fine, then the two of them would be placed in the bathyscaphe first thing in the morning. Altman's nightmares returned that night. He woke in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. Slowly he realized he was still on the base, and that Ada was sleeping beside him. He tried to fall asleep again when he heard a knock at the door. It was Stevens, who asked if they could talk. Altman tiptoed out of the room and followed him down the hall. The man opened the door to an empty laboratory and gestured for Altman to enter. Stevens asked if Altman had noticed anything strange about Hendricks. He said all the analyses and tests were fine, yet something troubled him. Hendricks looked normal, stable, but not quite the same as before. Stevens felt the man was hiding something. Altman admitted he did not know. He believed Hendricks was fine, that their dives had gone smoothly, with no tension, and that he trusted him. Stevens agreed and said he would report that everything could proceed. The next day they descended to 1,000 meters, then 2,000, when a groan sounded behind him. Altman turned and saw Hendricks's face had gone pale, tears streaming down his cheeks. Altman asked what had happened, and Hendricks sobbed that he did not want to die, that he kept thinking of Hennessy and Dante, and that whatever had happened to them was now happening to him. He said they should not be there. He could feel it. Altman told him that if he wanted to ascend, they would ascend, but since they were already there, they should at least take their measurements. Hendricks agreed, insisting he could still record data, that it was something he had to do. Altman left him with the equipment and continued the descent. Altman later praised him for good readings and said they should try to see how the signal behaved over time. Hendricks then suddenly said he thought his father was outside. Altman, stunned, asked what he had said, and Hendricks repeated it, waving toward the viewport and greeting an invisible figure. As Altman watched the instruments, he saw the signal intensity rise at the exact moment Hendricks began to see his father. Hendricks whispered that his father wanted to come in, that he was freezing out there, and told him not to worry because they would help him. Altman warned that it was not a good idea. Hendricks stood, stumbled toward the viewport, and began smashing his head against it, again and again. Altman grabbed him by the arm, telling him to stop, but Hendricks shoved him away, elbowed him across the face, and knocked him from his chair, screaming for his father to enter. Altman backed into the corner of the cabin. During the struggle, they had knocked the steering control, and the craft was now slowly descending. Altman hoped he could regain control before they struck the excavation machinery, clearing the approach to the crater. Hendricks was now pounding on the viewport with his fists and tried ripping at it with his nails. Altman looked around for a weapon. He stripped off his boots, modified, reinforced footwear with strong heels, and told Hendricks he could not let his father in that way, that he needed to open the hatch. Hendricks nodded and turned toward the ladder. The moment his hands touched the railing, Altman struck him on the back of the head with both boots like batons. Hendricks staggered. Altman struck him again, and again, until the frenzied man collapsed into a heap on the floor. Altman whispered an apology, saying he had found no other way. He tore Hendricks's shirt into strips, tied his hands, and bound them to his legs. He was about to return to the controls when a strange fish drifting through the searchlights caught his eye. Its shape was torn and incomplete, like a long fish folded and glued together. Its head was crowned with wavering, translucent shreds of flesh resembling a tail, and where fins should have been, there were small bony spikes growing from its sides. Intrigued, Altman pressed the recorder and captured the creature as it drifted into the darkness. Then he noticed something even stranger, patches drifting through the water like flat, pale pink clouds. Some kind of jellyfish? Fungus? He maneuvered the bathyscaphe closer. When the vessel touched it, some of the material clung to the viewport, caught on the rivets. Altman muttered a curse. Behind him, Hendricks groaned. He was tied up, but how long would the knots hold? They had to reach the surface as fast as possible. Altman disabled the automatic pressure distribution system and hit the ascent control. The bathyscaphe began to climb. He transmitted an SOS from 2,500 meters, but only static answered. Hendricks began to regain consciousness. At 2,000 meters, he had returned fully to hysterics. Altman tried to ignore it. At last, he heard a voice calling for him, asking if Michael Altman could hear. He shut off the SOS and switched to radio, explaining that Hendricks had lost control, that he had tied him up, and that the screaming behind him was Hendricks. He said he would explain more upon surfacing, and requested a security team at the dock. He pulled out his holopod, connected it to the console, and copied the recording of the fish. He wished he could also take a sample of the pink substance stuck to the viewport, but could not think how, until an idea came to him. Brutal, but the only option. The bathyscaphe neared the surface. Altman asked Hendricks where his father was. Hendricks said he had just been there. Altman told him they had left him behind. For a moment there was no reaction. And then, with an inhuman roar, Hendricks slammed his head into Altman's chest, knocking the breath out of him, then collapsed onto him, spitting and trying to bite his face. The hatch burst open as guards jumped inside and dragged Hendricks out. Altman scrambled back, dodging another guard who dropped in behind them and ran toward the ladder. Above, a cluster of guards surrounded the hatch with weapons raised. Altman shoved past them and stumbled out of the bathyscaphe, not onto the deck, but into the water. He had only a few seconds. Holding his breath, he swam to the viewport, peeled off a patch of the pink substance, and hid it in his pocket. After surfacing, Altman had only a few seconds to re-hide the substance before showering and heading to his audience with Markov. He told him almost everything. He mentioned the strange fish, knowing Markov would see the recording anyway, and he spoke of the pink material, while concealing the fact that he had taken a sample. Markov merely nodded. He said Hendricks was in bad shape, that the doctors kept injecting him with various drugs in an attempt to calm him, yet he continued to talk about his father. Altman explained that Hendricks had done the same down below, that he believed he saw his father outside the bathyscaphe and had tried to let him in. Altman added that they had created a diachronic record of the signal pulses. Strangely, it appeared to correlate with the decline in Hendricks's mental state. As the signal intensified, Hendricks began hallucinating, becoming violent and paranoid. As the signal dropped, he seemed to return to normal. Altman told him he believed the signal had altered him. Clearly, the pulse did something to the human brain. Markov asked why it had not affected Altman the same way, but Altman said he did not know. Markov told him they needed to descend again, and that he wanted Altman to make several dives, each with a different partner. Altman agreed, but insisted on having a tranquilizer gun, just in case, and on having whichever partner accompanied him strapped to the seat. Markov accepted the terms. Hendricks awoke in the medical ward. The last thing he could remember was being inside the bathyscaphe, he and Altman descending toward the bottom, and then the sudden, unbearable pain tearing through his head. He felt drained, parts of his body numb, his mind as if ripped out of him. An IV was in his forearm. He pulled it free immediately. The door opened, and a nurse entered. He imagined himself sprinting past her toward the far exit, yet his body refused to move. She approached, remarking gently that he was awake, and leaned in to adjust the IV. At that moment, his body decided to stand and seize her wrist. He was inside it, seeing with his own eyes, but the movements were not his. He watched his own hand lift the nurse as if she were a doll. He felt his jaws open and felt his teeth close on her throat, sensed the series of wet, sucking sounds and the rush of warm blood streaming down his chin and neck. He went to the door and tried to open it. It was still locked. How could that be? She had entered through it. She must have had a key. Only after pulling the blood-soaked card from what remained of her did he realize someone else was in the room. A figure stood in the shadow of the last bed. When Hendricks asked who it was, the voice replied, asking whether he did not recognize him. Hendricks said it was his father. His father told him it was good to see him, that they had a serious matter to discuss, and gestured for him to sit. Hendricks asked what it was about. His father said they were failing, that the thing they had found must be left where it was. The Convergence was not the only thing that mattered. They wanted them to become one, he said, and they had to be careful. Hendricks was told to warn everyone. Hendricks whispered that he would, that he promised. There was a noise behind him then, but he did not want to look away from his father. He feared that if he turned his head, the figure would vanish. Then came screams, a crash, a flash of light, and suddenly he was on the floor. Altman, meanwhile, had spoken with the ichthyologist about the photograph of the fish. The specialist said he had never seen anything like it. The DNA analysis of the pink substance in Scad's lab produced even more intriguing results. Scad said it was living tissue, like flesh, something that had once been alive, with an extremely unusual genetic profile, and he believed it had still been alive when Altman found it. Altman argued that it was impossible. When he had found it, it had looked exactly the same, just in larger pieces, and it could not have been alive. Scad remarked that he was skeptical, but said he could prove it with a simple experiment. He inverted the container, letting the substance sit on the table, took a battery with 2 attached wires, crossed them, and completed the circuit. Immediately the thing twitched and began to move. Scad, proud, said it was alive. A few hours later, Markov appeared in Altman's doorway with a tranquilizer gun in his hand, and asked if he had ever used one before. Altman shook his head. Markov opened the cartridge, explained where the dot was inserted, and warned him that it contained a powerful sedative that would take effect within seconds. He added that the shot would hurt the attacker, but not enough to stop him, and asked once more if Altman was certain he did not want a real firearm. Altman declined, and Markov told him they would depart in 15 minutes. Altman completed 2 dives. He had to use the tranquilizer only once. During the first descent, they reprogrammed the excavation drones, switching them to autopilot, greatly accelerating the work. But Altman had been forced to shoot the technician accompanying him when the man grew increasingly unhinged and finally attacked. His second partner was Stevens, the psychologist, who connected electrodes to both their heads, reading changes in their EEGs as they descended. When Altman asked whether he had learned anything, Stevens replied that he had, though he would have learned more if one of them had suffered an episode, and he assumed Altman would not be willing to grant him that favor. On the next dive, Altman descended with a cheerful engineer named David Kimball, whose task was to recover the notorious drilling bathyscaphe. They sank, saw the bathyscaphe, and saw the immense structure rising beside it, 2 twisted, spiraling columns entwined together and reaching upward. It looked as if it had been carved from stone. There was no longer any doubt the structure was artificial. It was covered in symbols, strange hieroglyphs unlike anything Altman had ever seen, winding around every inch of its surface. The structure was immense and gave the impression of being incredibly ancient, magnificent, and threatening at once. It looked wholly alien. Altman realized immediately it had not been made by human hands. What purpose had it served? How had it been created? The stone bore no gouges, no cracks, no seams, like a single monolithic piece. And the shape, it reminded him of something. Then he understood. He whispered that it was the devil's tail. Kimball muttered an awed curse. Altman slowly maneuvered the bathyscaphe in a circle above the structure, recording it from every angle. He had never seen anything more astonishing. He zoomed the camera to capture one symbol up close. Kimball admitted the sight unnerved him and urged that they retrieve the lost craft and get out. The sunken bathyscaphe lay right beside the base of the artifact. Altman descended and approached as closely as possible, shining the spotlight into the viewport. Even from here, the interior was a nightmare. Blood coated the windows and walls in chaotic patterns. He checked the exterior for structural breach and realized the hull was intact. It could, albeit slowly, be raised. He asked if Kimball was ready, and when he said yes, Altman initiated the lift. He watched the craft rise, past them at barely 6 meters, and ascend. It tilted slightly, revealing a severed arm sliding across the inner surface of the viewport. It was becoming a habit, Altman thought, as he carefully slipped a small piece of stone from the sampling unit. No one seemed to notice. Everyone was too busy with the recovered drilling bathyscaphe, scrubbing blood and decomposed flesh from the cabin and extracting the mutilated remains. Markov quarantined the platform quickly, but not before Altman had slipped away with the sample. He was sure the fragment had come from the artifact itself, though it looked, at a glance, like ordinary stone. Now that the bathyscaphe had been raised, the floating station buzzed with feverish preparation for raising the artifact. The people aboard looked both exhilarated and deeply anxious. Whatever lay down there could change everything, and they would be the first to make contact. The signal had resumed, though the broadcast now seemed altered, appearing and vanishing in a pattern of regular surges. Some researchers believed it to be a distress signal, though no one dared suggest what might be transmitting it. Altman was required to pilot the bathyscaphe daily with several of Markov's trusted personnel, but none of them showed the slightest sign of madness. Ada had been helping in the medical sector, and knew firsthand that violent incidents had doubled compared to the previous months, while suicide attempts had skyrocketed. Crew members were reporting visions of dead relatives, and more people, caught in trance-like states, were speaking about something they called the Convergence, only to awaken moments later unable to explain what it was. Altman went on another dive, this time with a researcher named Torquato, one of Markov's inner circle. The man was quiet, holding an odd black box on his lap. In silence, they descended toward the artifact and positioned themselves directly above it. The robotic machinery had already uncovered the base of the structure and was in the process of securing it in a net. The net was attached to a series of cables that would eventually connect to the lifting lines on the cargo ship. The artifact would be raised and then transferred through a waterlock into the floating complex. The manner in which Torquato lost his sanity differed from others. One moment he was sitting calmly, the next he was attacking. The straps on his seat had been cut, and he managed to seize Altman's gun and fire a tranquilizer dart into Altman's forearm. When Altman regained consciousness, he found himself pressed against the viewport. The bathyscaphe had wedged itself against the artifact, its engine still running. He immediately sent an SOS. Torquato was talking to someone invisible and trying to wrench open the hatch. By some miracle, Altman subdued him, only to realize a far greater problem. The oxygen recycler was broken, and there wasn't enough air for two. He asked himself whether he was a killer, whether he was the kind of man willing to let someone die in order to survive. He discovered that he was, and within minutes Torquato was dead. He checked for a pulse, but then the corpse twitched and spoke. Altman told it to return to the dead. Torquato replied that it wasn't so simple, and that Altman first needed to understand something. When Altman asked what, Torquato said, "This," and lunged. When Altman came to, his hands were locked around the corpse's neck. The body was stiff and cold, dead for a long time. He asked himself what was happening, and then he saw something strange. A woman, Ada's mother, who had died of cancer years before. She greeted him. Altman asked why she was there, whether she wasn't dead, and demanded to know who she really was, and why he was hallucinating her. Ada's mother ignored the questions. She said she had come to deliver a message about the marker. Altman asked what marker she meant. She told him he already knew what it was, that he had approached it many times but had somehow resisted it. She crossed her index and middle fingers toward him. Altman said she meant the devil's tail, the artifact. She nodded. She said he had to forget it, that the marker was dangerous, and had to remain where it had been found. The Convergence meant death, she warned. They must not give in to the marker, must not allow it to begin the Convergence. Altman asked what the Convergence meant. She said it meant that in the end, everything would have to begin anew. Altman tried to stand, but collapsed on his back, the world darkening around him before he blacked out. He awoke with an oxygen mask strapped to his face, surrounded by men in white coats whose surgical masks hid their expressions. Altman tried to move his arms, but couldn't. He needed to tell them about the marker, but only a rasping, meaningless sound forced its way out of his throat. He felt a needle enter his skin, and the world went dark again. When he regained consciousness, the room was empty, except for Stevens, Markov, and another man from Markov's inner circle, whose name he did not know. Markov commented that Altman was still alive, and appeared to be favored by fortune, then asked whether he could speak. Altman said he thought so. Markov told him to recount everything, and Altman did, beginning with Torquato's sudden assault, and describing in detail the hallucinations that followed. Markov instructed him that from this point on, he was to report everything unusual to Stevens immediately. Any dreams, any visions, anything that slipped outside the boundaries of ordinary experience. Then they left, and minutes later, Ada rushed into the room. After nearly dying in the bathyscaphe, his life felt replaced by another. He began to see more of the dead, people he had once known, his father, his sister, his teacher, Ada's mother, an old friend who had been hit by a car in high school. They appeared almost indistinguishable from the living and delivered messages that were vague, confusing, contradictory. Some warned against the convergence, others spoke of unity, but all urged him to leave the marker alone. One night, Ada saw her mother as well. When Altman asked what she had said, Ada told him she had said she loved her, and that they had to leave the marker undisturbed, forget they had ever found it. She insisted it was dangerous, and that everything was connected, the local legends, their visions, the artifact in the crater's center. She was certain of it. Ada sighed and asked why her mother could not stay with her, why she could not remain. And at the moment Ada sank deepest into depression and apathy, her mother returned. Altman was in the room with her and saw it too, but what he saw was not Ada's mother, but his own dead sister. Each apparition appeared in the form the viewer most longed to see, speaking in words and intonations that mimicked the real person's voice in life. Their messages varied in detail but always led toward the same event, the convergence. Yet when it came to explaining what the convergence was, or how it might be stopped, the dead grew evasive. Altman did not trust them. He tried to tell Ada they were not real, that they were manipulating them, using them. But Ada insisted she knew what she had seen, that her mother had been as real as anything around her. Altman did exactly as he had been ordered, and told Stevens about his hallucinations, mentioning Ada as well. Stevens said that Michael and his girlfriend were not the only ones who experienced such visions. Others were seeing the same things more and more often, and it was always the dead they had once loved, those whose words they were inclined to take seriously. He admitted he had no idea what the purpose of these apparitions was, whether they were trying to drive everyone insane, or, considering the rising number of suicides, simply trying to destroy them. The behavior aboard the station continued to shift in ways that were impossible to overlook. Reports of people losing their minds became routine. Many of them attacked colleagues before turning on themselves. Once, hearing shouting in the hallway, Michael stepped outside and saw a scientist holding a laser scalpel to his own throat, warning everyone not to come closer. The man hissed that it was already too late, that they were all dead, or nearly dead, that there was no escaping what awaited them, and that it was better to leave now before they became one of them. Then, with a swift, horrifying motion, he slashed his own throat. For a moment the wound did not bleed. The scalpel had cauterized it. But then blood began to pulse outward in a thick stream from his severed carotids. He let out a horrible gurgling sound as air hissed from both his mouth and the slit in his throat, then staggered forward and collapsed. The marker dominated every conversation on the station. Michael had no idea who first suggested that it was a work of alien technology, but the idea spread quickly, and soon many were convinced. One day he accidentally overheard a strange gathering. A preacher-like voice declared that unless one understood what it meant to become one with the marker, one would never gain eternal life. Michael realized with horror that he was witnessing the birth of a new religion. To his shock, Ada joined the sect, and it drove a wedge between them. From what she told him, Michael pieced together the believers' philosophy. They considered the marker sacred, sent by God for the salvation of humanity, a bizarre fusion of Christianity and pagan mysticism. Michael realized that soon a new conflict would erupt aboard the station, as crew members divided themselves into believers and non-believers. Meanwhile, preparations to raise the marker continued. Altman descended twice more in the submersible alone to monitor the robots attaching cables to the net that now enveloped the marker. Each time at depth he encountered the ghost of Ada's mother, and each time her fragmented warnings confused him further. The apparition insisted that they must not study the marker, claiming that if they disobeyed, they would succumb to convergence, and in the end be forced to begin again from the very beginning. One night, late in the evening, there was a knock at his cabin door. Field stood there with 12 others. He explained that they had come to ask Altman to lead them. They said he had seen the marker and spent more time near it than anyone else. They claimed to know what had happened in the submersible, that when it killed the others, it left him alive, and insisted that it spoke to him. They were convinced he had been chosen. Michael told them he did not believe in the nonsense they were preaching. They stared at him in disbelief. Field smiled slyly and said they understood. It was merely a test, and the time had not yet come. They promised to watch and wait, ready to stand at his side when the appointed hour arrived. One by one they left, each pausing to touch him as though he were some kind of charm. A chill ran down Altman's spine. Suspended 5 meters above the marker, Altman watched as the main cable tightened. The machines had excavated the base of the marker, but whether it would actually move was impossible to predict. In truth, part of him hoped it would not budge at all. The marker sagged heavily within the harness, and for a moment he thought the net would snap. It groaned and swayed slowly in the darkness. Then, with a deep, grinding sound, strangely distorted by the water, the marker tore free from the ground and began to rise. It ascended slowly through the abyss. Only when they were already halfway to the surface did Altman realize that he had not been hallucinating earlier. He checked the readings and saw that the signal had ceased broadcasting at roughly the same moment the marker was lifted. Maybe, he thought, they had shut it off. He wished he knew whether that had been the right decision, or a catastrophic mistake. The water around them had changed now. The darkness was thinning, and he could see the marker more clearly than ever before. In this brighter light it was even more imposing, covered in carved symbols and dark, spiraling lines etched directly into the stone. Still, he could not see a single seam or fracture. It looked as though it had been formed from one solid monolithic mass. When they were 500 meters from the station, Markov ordered the ascent to stop. He thanked Altman for his assistance up to this stage and told him that the deep-sea craft was no longer required, instructing him to return to the submarine bay. Altman had no idea what Markov was planning, but he obeyed. Once out of the submersible, he headed toward the chamber he believed would become the marker's storage vault, but guards were already stationed at the entrance and refused to admit him without special clearance. The marker had been at the surface for less than 24 hours, yet the station's atmosphere had changed drastically. Several researchers were declared non-essential and transferred back to the Dredgercorp ground facility, a place that functioned less like a laboratory and more like a prison for scientists who were no longer needed but could not be safely released. Ada was among those removed. Altman, holding the fragment of the marker in his pocket, told Field that he needed help. He said he had to see the marker and asked whether Field could make it happen. Field replied that it was impossible. The artifact was too heavily guarded. Altman insisted that it was important, and that he would never have asked otherwise. He added that some of the believers were part of Markov's inner circle. Then he drew the stone fragment from his pocket and showed it to Field, telling him it needed to be returned. Field accepted the fragment with trembling reverence, cradling it as though it were a newborn child. His face lit up in a way that frightened Altman. Field thanked him for choosing him, fell to his knees, and pledged to do everything in his power to help Altman make the marker whole again. Around 3 in the morning, there was a knock at Altman's door. It was Field, accompanied by Henry Harmon, who wore the black robe that marked him as part of Markov's inner circle. They dressed Michael in identical black clothing. Harmon explained that no one would try to stop them as long as he wore the uniform. No one would question his pass. Any problems would come later, and Harmon said that was a risk he was willing to bear. They approached the guarded entrance. The guards barely glanced at Altman's forged clearance before letting them through. Inside, a series of scaffolding walkways rose along the walls, allowing the researchers to reach any part of the marker. Towering and massive, the artifact dominated the entire chamber. Seen out of the water for the first time, Altman fully grasped its scale and alien strangeness. Power seemed to radiate from it. It felt dangerous. At the same time, he felt a familiar scientific hunger waking inside him, the profound desire to study it. He pulled out his holopod and began to record video. Afterward, he searched the surface for the spot where the missing fragment had come from. He had only just begun when Harmon seized him by the wrist and whispered that they had to leave. Altman nodded. 5 minutes later, he was back in his cabin, hastily packing his belongings. He kept the fragment of stone with him. He copied the data from his holopod onto a memory card and hid it inside the lining of his jacket, then lay down on the bed and waited. In the morning, he was to be escorted to the boat that would take him to Ada and the other scientists. Before him were 2 paths. He could pretend the marker had never existed and live an ordinary life, or he could choose the second path, dangerous, possibly fatal, by trying to make the material about the marker public so that scientists, rather than the military, would be drawn to study it. When he closed his eyes, he already knew which one he would choose. Markov moved from one holographic file to another. Still nothing. They had tried everything they could think of, but the marker did not react, nor did it answer in any way. They had exposed it to electrical current, attempted irradiation, and subjected it to radio waves, microwaves, and electromagnetic pulses. Nothing worked. The marker had resumed broadcasting. At the moment, the signal was very faint. Some of the researchers had begun seeing their dead relatives again. Others remained unaffected. The messages from the apparitions were the same. Leave the marker alone. Markov believed they needed to find a way to harness the power of the marker, and quickly. He was convinced that once controlled, this technology would bring him immense power, perhaps even dominion over the world. The only obstacle was the group of believer scientists. They hoped to prove to the marker that they were worthy enough for it to begin teaching them. They refused to permit anything that might threaten the marker, damage it, or risk earning its disfavor toward humanity. Their demands, in Markov's view, were absurd, and he dismissed them outright. But within a few days, the situation escalated so severely that he was forced to contact Officer Chicxulub and report a mutiny among the scientists who now refused to leave the marker chamber. Chicxulub told him not to take action until he arrived and then cut the connection. By the time Chicxulub and his team reached the containment level, the situation had deteriorated even further. The scientists, led by Field, had formed a ring around the marker, holding hands, and Chicxulub demanded to know what they thought they were doing. He said their demands had been received and rejected, and asked what their problem was. Field told him they were trying to do what was right. Chicxulub replied that what was right for them was to return to their quarters. He warned them once more before, as he said, ending the discussion. Field shook his head. Chicxulub raised his plasma pistol and shot Field in the leg. Field collapsed with a cry, and the chamber erupted into chaos. Gunfire erupted from both sides. People screamed, bodies fell. Then Chicxulub had an idea. He lunged toward Field, who writhed in pain on the floor, dropped to one knee beside him, seized his head, and forced him to watch as Chicxulub fired at the marker. Field screamed, horrified, begging him not to harm it. Chicxulub shouted at him to tell his people to stop fighting, to lay down their weapons and surrender, or he would order every guard in the room to fire on the marker. To prove he meant it, he fired at the marker again. Field, wincing in pain, told the others that for the good of the marker they had to yield the battle. He urged them to lay down their weapons and not resist. Chicxulub was astonished to see every one of them obey without question. The next 20 minutes were spent placing the believers under guard and tending to the wounded. Chicxulub spent the entire evening smiling. He had not enjoyed himself this much since the firefights on the moon. It would have been an amusing day, if only his head did not hurt so badly. In the facility where Michael and Ada were now being held, there were about 20 people, and many of them sensed that the pulse had resumed. Adherents of the new religion kept approaching Altman, hoping for some kind of sign or blessing. At first he tried to explain that such things were impossible and that he was no prophet, but convincing them proved difficult. Eventually he took to muttering a few cryptic words or offering a quick, vague benediction so they would leave him alone. He realized he could easily manipulate them to escape, but he was not willing to risk anyone's life. One late night as he walked down the corridor, Altman saw that the guard posted at the entrance door was talking to himself. The man pointed into empty space, then dropped his rifle. It clattered to the floor, and the guard walked away down the corridor, passing Altman without so much as a glance. No one was guarding the door. Without hesitating, Michael grabbed Ada, his wallet, and his holopod, and ran. There was still no one by the door, and the key remained in the lock. With trembling fingers, he turned it and pushed the door open. Stevens asked Markov if he had seen the footage yet. Then he stretched out a hand and activated the video feed. On screen appeared Altman standing behind a podium at a press conference in Washington. The crawl beneath him read, "Scientist accuses military of cover-up then. Extraterrestrial life confirmed." Altman was describing the marker and the expedition. The image flickered and shifted to footage of the marker itself, filmed inside the underwater chamber. Markov demanded to know where Altman had gotten it, and ordered his people to find out. On the screen, Altman claimed that the military wanted to hide the marker. He said they intended to control the research, so they could use alien technology to create weapons, and insisted that the public had to demand oversight of the marker and its purpose. Beneath him, the caption now asked, "Michael Altman, whistleblower or paranoid?" Markov ordered his people to find out which hotel Altman was staying in, and within 15 minutes the adjacent room had been booked. Markov was already on his way to the airport. Altman had checked into the historic Watergate Hotel. It had been a long day for him. First the press conference, Then the personal interviews. Again and again he explained in detail what the marker was and where it had been found, but he avoided mentioning the hallucinations. Michael wanted to steer clear of any suggestion that the marker possessed consciousness. He said nothing about the strange creature on the beach, did not show them the devil's tail sign, and did not mention that the Yucatan Maya believed the devil's tail had been buried deep beneath the waves, precisely where the marker had been discovered. Altman quickly realized that most of the media saw him as a kind of extremist to be paraded around. They were more interested in exposing inconsistencies and contradictions in his story than in uncovering the truth. When Altman and Ada returned to the hotel, they found that the wall to the neighboring room had been smashed through, and Markov was comfortably seated in their armchair. Any thought of escape was immediately dismissed. When Altman turned, the silenced barrel of a pistol was already pressed toward his face, and another was aimed at Ada. Markov told him to call another press conference and make them understand that he had been pranked, that there was no marker, no secret organization, and that he had only fallen victim to an unbelievable hoax. Altman refused. Markov said that if he complied, he would be allowed to return to marker research with full access. Altman repeated that he did not want to. Markov insisted they were not asking what he wanted. They were offering a choice between going with them or dying. Altman told him to kill him without hesitation. Markov observed him calmly and said that perhaps it sounded superstitious, but he believed the marker had some purpose for Altman. He claimed he had no desire to kill him. Not yet. Then he nodded toward Ada, and the guard's pistol shifted to her head. Markov added that he had no such reservations where Altman's girlfriend was concerned, and so Altman found himself back where he had begun. He and Ada were separated, and he was sent to undergo examinations under Stevens. Altman asked why he was still alive. Stevens explained that Altman had survived multiple deep-sea descents in the bathysphere, while others had lost their sanity. Even when he suffered headaches and hallucinations, these did not push him toward violence or madness the way they did the others. Many of the believers on board showed near religious reverence toward him, and Stevens admitted that he found himself half sharing their belief. Altman insisted it was madness. Stevens replied that the believers saw him as a resisting prophet. Then he said that the only reason Altman was still alive was because Stevens had a use for him. A recent firefight between believers and non-believers had resulted in several deaths. The crew was splitting into opposing factions. If things continued this way, more people would die. Stevens claimed he wanted to prevent that and thought Altman could help. The believers trusted him. They might listen to him. Altman replied that the pulse transmission had begun again, and that the conflict between believers and non-believers was hardly Stevens's greatest problem. When Altman managed to speak with Field, the man behaved like a true religious zealot. Altman noticed new ornaments worn by many of the scientists, cords bearing a symbol made of two narrow metal strips twisted together into the shape of the marker. Periodically, they clutched these cords and murmured prayers. Returning to his work, Altman became more and more convinced that he had been right from the beginning, that the marker's primary purpose had nothing to do with the benefit of humanity. What that purpose actually was, however, he still could not say. He worried about Ada and wondered what the visions were truly trying to communicate. Something was being lost in transmission. That was likely why the messages delivered by the dead were so fragmented. He shared his thoughts with Stevens. Altman suggested that they interpreted the marker's words positively, because humans were inclined to believe in an afterlife, and because the marker spoke to them using the voices of the people they loved. Stevens agreed that it was logical, noting that clearly the marker wanted them to perceive its intentions favorably, but Altman argued that if one listened carefully to what the hallucinations said and tried to hear them as alien messages filtered through human memories, then an entirely different image of convergence emerged. What if convergence did not mean eternal life or transcendence, but complete subjugation? What if unity was meant literally, the destruction of the individual into a larger collective entity? Stevens asked if he meant something like certain insect colonies, some form of hive intelligence controlling all individuals. Altman said yes, or perhaps something even more extreme. What if the marker intended to transform them from many creatures into one? Stevens said it sounded impossible. Altman replied that it was a new frontier. They could not claim to know what was possible or impossible. Stevens brought up another point. Some of the dead spoke of unity, others of ticking clocks. What did that mean? What did it have to do with convergence? Was the marker awakening now to punish them for failing to use their time wisely? Altman admitted he did not know. Perhaps it was not punishment at all, but something far more serious. The dead behaved as though they were facing a deadline. Convergence was described as a chance to start over, but he could not imagine what such a beginning would mean for them. Stevens observed that if Altman was right, then the human race stood on the brink of extinction. Whatever convergence was, it implied the end of life as they understood it. Altman agreed. Stevens asked what they should do. Altman said it had to be stopped. Stevens responded that he approached the question differently. He could choose to believe what Altman was telling him, or he could believe that the marker acted in their best interests. If he believed Altman, then humanity was likely doomed, and he would spend his final days agonizing over an unsolvable problem. But if he believed that the marker had benevolent intentions, then he could move forward full of hope toward his own salvation. Showalter made a breakthrough when he suggested that the symbols on the marker were in fact a kind of mathematical code representing DNA. He explained that they believed this code was also carried within the pulse, deliberately introducing subtle changes into the genetic structure of human organisms, and that this, in fact, might have been the origin of human life. Altman was at a loss for words. The thought that human existence had emerged not through evolution or divine creation, but through the marker was overwhelming. He asked why the marker would retransmit their genetic code at all, if humanity had already evolved, and what purpose such an act could serve. Showalter admitted that he did not know. Another scientific team had also decoded the pulse, and although their calculations were correct, the results they obtained were entirely different. To them, the transmission signaled the beginning of a destructive process. Showalter suggested that perhaps one group was mistaken, or that the marker was confused, sending contradictory signals. Altman wondered aloud whether the marker might simply be malfunctioning, and whether they could restore it by returning the extracted drill sample to its original place. Showalter responded that they had already tried, and that it had changed nothing. Judging from the structure, the only possible way to stop the marker's functioning would be to pulverize it. Herr Dr. Gut had not slept for several hours. With the help of his team, he had analyzed the synthetic molecular DNA chain and, through nanosystems, produced a biotic composite model of it. He reviewed the results carefully to ensure their accuracy, believing they could reveal whether the marker had been damaged or was acting intentionally. When he checked the incubation chamber, he was startled to discover that all 40 cells in all 40 containers had multiplied. It was unprecedented, not only the fact of their reproduction, but the astonishing speed of it. For the next hour he watched as every container became filled with a pale pink substance that was unmistakably biological tissue. He wondered whether he should examine it more closely. He opened a container and passed a mild electrical charge through the sample. The substance twitched as though it felt the shock, perhaps even pain. He inverted the container, spilling the material onto the table. Before him lay a faintly undulating mass. Using a scalpel, he carefully cut it in half, then watched as the substance knit itself back together into a seamless sheet, leaving no visible line or scar. It was extraordinary, he thought. He was still experimenting when the face of his grandmother appeared above the table, hovering in midair. Startled, he recoiled. She told him that the time had come, that he had already learned too much, and that he had to stop his research before it was too late. He protested, insisting that his work was important, and that he was making discoveries beyond human imagination. She insisted that what he was doing was dangerous, and that the marker would destroy him unless he stopped. He begged her to leave, refusing to meet her eyes, but she remained. He reminded himself that she was nothing more than a mental construct, his mental construct, and that if he could simply stop thinking about her, he might dispel her presence. All he needed to do, he thought, was to shut himself down for a while, and he would be fine. He reached for the drawer where a sedative-filled syringe was kept. She cried out for him to stop, claiming that he would only harm himself and that this was exactly what the marker desired, urging him to listen. Muttering that he only needed sleep, he injected himself, telling himself it would only be for a few hours. A burning sensation traveled through his vein, and his arm began to tingle. His grandmother looked at him with a sorrowful, horrified expression. She asked whether he truly believed the substance was a sedative, shook her head, and stepped back in dread. She insisted he had only accelerated the convergence, and urged him to hurry to the marker, claiming that the space surrounding it was dead space, a neutral zone that would halt the process, overtaking him. She told him to go there, to show the others what had happened to him, to warn them, and to try to stop the convergence before it was too late. Then she slowly dissolved into nothingness. Horrified, Gut stared at the empty container on the table, the empty syringe, and realized what he had just injected. The substance began spreading through his arm, searing painfully. He triggered the alarm. He had to reach the marker. She had said it would save him. Forcing his way past the guards as the alarm wailed, he dragged himself forward, weakening with every step, crawling until at last he managed to touch the marker. Whatever had been happening inside his arm appeared to stop. The marker was helping him. The marker had halted it. He sighed with relief. Then the door behind him opened, and Krax shot him in the forehead. Krax ordered the guards to take the body to a laboratory, examine it, and report what had happened. The scientist prepared to begin the autopsy, but strange sounds beneath the sheet made them hesitate. What lay beneath the sheet barely resembled a human being anymore. The head was still present, but now it was framed by curtains of flesh formed from what had once been the shoulders. The remains of the chest rose and fell in rapid, shuddering motions. The legs had atrophied, the arms had grown unnaturally long, and the entire body had flattened and become ridged, as if the skin had stretched into something like the body of a ray. The three scientists froze in astonishment, while Field watched the scene unfold through the video link. One of the scientists whispered in horror that it was impossible. A crackling sound followed, and the body continued to change. What was left of the face shrank and disappeared, except for the eyes and the mouth, which by then had become more of a gaping fissure. It split apart, unleashing a cluster of tendrils or antennae, insectoid in appearance. The arms and legs shriveled away, replaced by bony hooks. The creature emitted a piercing shriek and began thrashing violently. Field ordered the scientist to evacuate the laboratory at once. The alarm sounded again. One of the three ran for the door, but the other two were paralyzed by terror. The creature sat on the edge of the table, wheezing faintly with each breath, rocking its torso up and down. It suddenly leapt onto one of them, wrapping around his shoulders and head, trying to press its slick, fleshy body against his face. The man screamed, but the sound was quickly smothered. Through the video link, Field watched as a strange proboscis burst from the creature and plunged through the man's eye deep into his skull. The tendril pulsed as it pumped something inside. The body collapsed to the floor. The creature retracted the proboscis and slowly crawled away. Within moments, perhaps even seconds, the corpse began to change. Field watched the man's skin turn pale purple, heard the sound of tearing flesh, and saw bony blades erupt from the shoulders. A second set of forearms seemed to push outward from the gut wall, the fingers extending. His hair fell away, his eyes sank into his skull, and his ears slid down his face toward his neck. Slowly, the new creature rose and staggered toward the laboratory door. The last scientist had crouched in the corner, whimpering softly. The thing that had once been Herr Dr. Gut dragged itself across the floor toward him and then lunged. Field cut the connection. He could not bear to listen to the screams. The alarm jolted Altman awake from a pleasant dream in which he and Ada had been planning a future together. He stepped into the corridor and saw a panicked researcher sprinting past. Altman asked him what had happened, but the man only shouted that they were everywhere, that even shooting them did not stop them, before disappearing around the corner. Altman wondered if he was still dreaming. He followed the path the man had taken and found the hallway barricaded with a laboratory table turned on its side. As he approached, gunfire erupted, bullets thudding into the wall beside his head. He shouted for them not to shoot and raised his hands. Voices answered, and the gunfire stopped. Someone behind the barricade motioned for him to come closer. He obeyed. Showalter told him he was relieved that none of the creatures had reached Altman. When Altman demanded an explanation, Showalter admitted he did not fully know what they were dealing with. He said he had seen only one and wished he never had. It had been monstrous. Bone scythes instead of arms and legs, moving like a spider. The head had dangled from the torso, eyes fixed on the floor, yet somehow it had been able to see them. Judging by the scraps of clothing clinging to its body, it had once been human. But it clearly was not anymore. Showalter handed Altman a pistol, though he admitted it might not matter because shooting the things did not kill them. They just kept coming. Altman told him to contact Field. Field was at the upper levels, and Altman reasoned the creatures had not reached that far yet. He instructed Showalter to tell Field to seal the airlock and wait for them. Altman and the others would try to reach him, and once they arrived, Field would let them inside. A terrible roar echoed down the corridor. Something dragged its feet as it emerged from around the far corner. It was roughly the height of a grown man, but with strangely stunted arms protruding from its abdomen. From its shoulder joints extended a pair of segmented bone scythes, like the wings of a plucked bird. Its skin was mottled and seeping, the stench that of half-rotten flesh. It was humanoid, but Altman would never have recognized it as human, if not for the tattered remains of a security uniform hanging from its torso. Dragging its feet, the creature shuffled toward them, then abruptly froze. It growled and charged. Showalter shouted for them to fire. The three men opened fire immediately. The bullets slowed the creature only slightly. They did not appear to inflict real harm. With shocking ease, it vaulted the barricade and seized one of the scientists. The man screamed and tried to flee, but the creature's sharp scythe slashed across his back, painting it red. As though embracing him, it pulled the scientist close before burying its teeth into his neck. It was a horrifying sight. Altman knew that if he did not kill it, he would be next. He moved in as close as he could, pressed the muzzle of the pistol to the creature's neck, and fired 4 point-blank shots. It was enough to nearly sever the head, but even decapitated, the thing's body continued to thrash. Altman kept firing and stomping on its limbs until they were reduced to fragments that he hoped would no longer pose a threat. Even then, he was not entirely sure it was dead. Meanwhile, the body of the fallen scientist had begun to distort, and Altman realized that it too was transforming into another creature. After spending several more precious minutes and half a magazine, they dismembered the emerging monstrosity and fled. They managed to reach field by comm, and he confirmed that all the creatures were still contained on the lower levels. He told them he would head for the airlock, seal it, and wait for whichever survivors managed to reach him. Altman insisted they would need something far more effective than pistols if they hoped to survive, anything that could sever limbs or at least disable them. In the first laboratory they entered, they found a portable plasma cutter as well as a laser scalpel. Using tools from the adjoining room, they managed to modify one of the laser pistols into a wide-beam variant. Elsewhere, Markov demanded that Chicxulub explain what in hell was happening in the habitation decks. He pointed at the array of screens displaying the chaos erupting throughout the floating complex. On one screen, a man was impaled by an unknown creature that resembled something between a spider and a whirling bladed death. On another, people were stacking barricades. A third showed a hallway littered with torn limbs and chunks of flesh. Chicxulub insisted he had no idea what was happening and claimed he had never seen anything like it. Stevens said the creatures looked disturbingly familiar. He pointed out that one of them had formerly been Anderson. Its tattered face and scraps of clothing confirmed it. Chicxulub noted that evacuation preparations were complete and urged that they leave. Markov said he was not the kind of man who fled a battlefield. Chicxulub countered that this was not a human enemy. They were dealing with something alien. He said that shooting the creatures 2 or 3 times in the head did nothing, that even destroying the head entirely did not stop them. Markov finally declared that it would be a tactical withdrawal. They would leave, regroup, reroute the cameras to the rescue vessel, and observe. It would, he said, be highly informative. Altman's small group pressed through the laboratories. Along the way, they encountered several more creatures and managed to avoid nearly all of them, dispatching only 2 without losses. Then Michael saw it. Something thick and organic was growing through one of the ventilation ducts and spreading across the floor, as though merging with the very structure. He pointed at it with his cutter and remarked that it was beginning to proliferate through the vents. They were nearly at the door to the next laboratory when the grate above them burst open and something dropped to the floor, narrowly missing them. It was shapeless and pulsating, a heaving mound that sometimes spread flat like a puddle. It slid slowly across the floor, leaving behind a hissing trail. Whatever it touched was either absorbed entirely or corroded to bare metal. In its shifting contours, Altman glimpsed a half-dissolved skull, and once, something that resembled a smiling human face. Altman grabbed a hydrogen canister with a torch nozzle attached and blasted the creature with flame. It ignited instantly, boiling into black, bubbling sludge, but half a dozen more creatures were already advancing from the next laboratory. Michael gave the burning mass one last jet of flame before turning and grabbing his cutter. One scientist was already dead. The rest hacked desperately at the attackers with laser scalpels. One creature's bone scythe opened a deep wound in Altman's arm, and he nearly dropped his tool. He caught a glimpse of Showalter stumbling, falling, and being swallowed by the pulsating mass, disappearing instantly. The bone-bladed creature chasing him was engulfed as well. Altman was alone. As Altman made his way upward through the complex, he encountered fewer and fewer creatures. Those he did see, he either slipped past or dispatched quietly, careful not to draw the attention of anything else lurking nearby. Then he stumbled upon something assembled not from a single corpse, but from several. It resembled a spider, though its blade-like limbs served as legs, and its body was composed of torsos crudely fused together. Two heads swayed weakly at one end, and on its underside a yellow-black mass, perhaps a kind of tumor, throbbed. It rushed toward him, but before he could get close enough to cut it with his cutter, one of the heads clawed its way to the top of the creature's body and hurled itself at him. It struck his chest, wrapped tough tendon-like appendages around his neck, and began to tighten. Altman hammered at it with the flat side of his cutter. The head loosened its grip only slightly, but it was enough for him to wedge a hand between it and his throat and tear it free. He reached his pistol and fired at the creature, trying to cripple as many limbs as possible. Then one of the rounds struck the yellow-black growth. A violent explosion followed, and the blast hurled him down the corridor. Limping and still half-stunned, he dragged himself to the end of the hall and pounded on the hatch to the airlock chamber. The door opened, and he staggered inside. Field told him that he had nearly lost hope and thanked the marker for Altman's survival. Altman's first question was where Ada was, explaining that he had received a video message from her. Field asked what he meant and said he assumed she was still confined on the mainland, adding that he had not seen her in days. Altman considered whether the marker had shown him the vision, though he wondered how that could be. The marker only ever showed the dead. But as the realization dawned on him, his blood turned cold. From the moment she had appeared to him, Ada must already have been dead. He followed Field out of the airlock and up through the complex, moving through a series of exposed chambers and along a curving corridor toward the main dome. The elevator was down, forcing them to use the stairs. Field began to speak, but suddenly gagged and fell silent. Altman looked down and saw something like a pale grey serpent, or a long length of intestine, wrapped tightly around Field's throat. One end was coiled around the staircase. The other was cinched firmly around his neck. With a sharp jerk, the thing tore Field's head free, sending it tumbling like a grape to the floor below. His body clattered after it, bouncing off the walls and metal rails. Altman watched as the strangler slid sinuously downward. Reaching the floor, it moved in rippling waves toward Field's decapitated corpse. He saw it prod the abdomen, then watched one end taper to a point and press through the skin. Slowly, with rhythmic movements, it burrowed into the body. The stomach swelled and distended until, with a final contraction, the creature vanished inside entirely. A vision of Ada appeared before him. He asked where she was, and who had killed her. She told him he was needed, that she required him to finish what he had begun, and that everyone was in grave danger. She insisted he had to stop the Convergence. When he asked what Convergence was, she told him he had already seen it, and that he needed to prevent it. Then she vanished. Altman had descended only a few steps down the staircase, when something dropped onto him. He caught only a fleeting glimpse before it wrapped itself around his face. It was a human head stretched unnaturally thin and elastic, from which numerous tendrils sprouted, and it immediately began to suffocate him. Blindly groping, Altman found the trigger of his cutter, activated it, and felt the blade pass through the creature's flesh. It lost its grip, and he flung it aside. After catching his breath, he continued downward. Emergency lighting cast shifting shadows across the walls, and in those shadows he continually glimpsed shapes moving. He looked below and briefly saw the same sinewy, pulsating mass that had torn Field's head free. Then it vanished, reappearing on the opposite side of the staircase. Now it was scarcely a meter beneath him, its grey body blending against the metal steps. One end released its hold on the stair and began swaying, like a charmed serpent searching for flesh to seize. Suddenly, one of its tendrils lashed upward and wrapped around his ankle. Altman cut the creature in half with his plasma cutter. It emitted a stream of rancid pus and dropped away. More shapes stirred below. Other creatures were gathering, and Altman fought through them one by one. The next half hour collapsed into a blur of blood and flesh flying in every direction, coating him from head to foot. Then the most horrifying creature he had yet encountered appeared before him. Its mouth gaped impossibly wide, bristling with predatory teeth, and the flesh around it was torn back to the jaw joints. Its arms had become forelimbs suited for sprinting, and its torso thickened toward the front and tapered sharply at the rear. A single massively muscled leg jutted from its backside, while the second leg had become an elongated, withered appendage that writhed like a tail, ending in a fan of spindly toes. It gathered itself and leapt. Altman rolled aside but could not avoid the claws that pierced through his shirt and into his shoulder. With desperate effort, he reached his laser cutter and activated it, severing the creature's foremost limb, the one pinning him down. It gave him just enough time to flee. He pushed through several laboratories and patched himself into the still-functioning emergency video system. Scanning the feeds, he saw more creatures swarming the complex. Not far from his location, the fleshy sludge creature had grown enormous and continued to expand, absorbing everything in its path. Realizing he could not go that way, he concluded that the submarine bay was his only remaining option. Reckless, perhaps suicidal, but the only path left. A screen flickered behind him. A man demanded to know who had accessed the system. Altman recognized Henry Harmon, the same man who had first brought him to see the marker in the containment chamber. Altman identified himself and asked whether Harmon was still alive. Harmon answered that he was trapped within the marker chamber, but, for unknown reasons, the creatures refused to approach the marker. He expressed relief that Altman had survived. Altman told him he was coming, and asked whether Harmon could open the doors to the submarine bay from his location. Harmon confirmed he could, though he did not understand the purpose. Altman instructed him to open and keep them open, explaining that it was the only way he could reach him. He also told Harmon to gather every shred of data on the marker available in the system, its signal, structure, dimensions, composition, everything. Altman made his way to the submersible platforms, rummaging through lockers and storage containers for a diving suit or oxygen tank, but found only 2 coils of rope, each 15 meters long. He resigned himself to the risk. Upon reaching the boat platform, he tied the rope securely and dropped it into the water, where a submersible gleamed faintly far below. Altman knew he had only one chance. Once he reached a certain depth, there would be no turning back. He would either surface in the submarine bay or drown on the way. He swam as fast as his exhausted body allowed. Pressure built around him, squeezing his skull, and by the time he reached the bay, he was close to blacking out. He shoved his cutter into a corner and slapped the control panel. Emergency lights flickered as the bulkhead began to descend, sealing the opening. Beneath him, muffled by water, he heard the grind of the barrier locking into place, followed by the rhythmic thrum of the pumps. As the water level fell, he broke the surface, gasped for air, and immediately lost consciousness. When he awoke, he was trembling uncontrollably. He wiped the moisture from the communication module's screen and contacted the marker chamber. He identified himself. Harmon squinted at the screen and admitted he had doubted Altman was still alive, asking whether the image was merely another vision, noting that Altman looked different. Altman insisted he was alive, just very wet. Harmon explained that the creatures would not approach the marker, and that if Altman could reach the final corridor, he would be safe, although getting that far might prove far more difficult. The corridor was lined with an organic layer resembling flesh, as though he had been dragged into the bowels of some colossal intestine. It felt like walking through a nightmare. His path was blocked by a corpse, and when Altman tried to push it aside, the body hissed and lunged at him. He stumbled, slipped, and the creature was immediately on top of him, its bone scythe slicing downward in an attempt to sever his head. Altman managed to reach his plasma cutter and split the creature in half. Its 2 pieces fell to either side, and he stamped each part repeatedly until they stopped moving entirely. He knew he had to move forward as quietly as possible, cross the corridor, and reach safety. He was nearly there when noise erupted behind him. Pressing his access card to the scanner, he silently begged for the door to open before the creature reached him. He sprinted into the final corridor and glanced over his shoulder, seeing a 3-headed, spider-like creature. It was different from the one he had encountered earlier. Its back was covered in spikes, and one of them launched toward Altman, embedding itself into the wall next to his face. All 3 inverted heads hissed in unison, but the creature did not advance. Then the door between them sealed shut. Harmon greeted him with fervent relief, convinced that Altman had been destined to come, and that the marker itself had willed it. Harmon claimed the marker protected and loved him, that when he had touched it, he had felt that love, and urged Altman to touch it as well. Altman reached out. What he felt was not love, but something entirely different, something he had never experienced before. It was as though every hallucination he had ever suffered, every memory, every moment of fear or clarity had unfolded at once, layered over itself. It felt as if the marker had rearranged the structure of his mind, rewired his synapses to force comprehension. For an instant, Altman sensed the marker's structure from the inside. When he regained consciousness, Harmon was stroking his head with a beatific smile. Altman pushed him away, stood up, and went straight to the monitor. Frenziedly, he began inputting information and sketching structural diagrams of the marker. His hands moved faster than his mind could follow, working simultaneously on multiple sections, jumping from file to file, assembling fundamental schematics for what amounted to a blueprint of a new marker. Harmon, confused, asked what he was doing, and Altman explained that he finally understood and needed Harmon's help to translate the material and transmit the signal back to the marker, essentially feeding it an encoded representation of itself. Harmon questioned the idea, but Altman insisted. What he had assembled was far from complete. It would take years of work to finish, but he hoped that for the present moment it would be enough to halt the process of convergence. Hours passed as they experimented with different methods of transmission, until at last the marker emitted a short, intense burst of energy, and then fell silent, as abruptly as it had begun broadcasting. Harmon asked what had happened, and Altman answered that the marker was resting, that they had done what it required of them and had saved the world. Even after this, he sat for a long while thinking. Why had the marker needed to reproduce? What consequences would that entail? And if the hallucinations and visions had not originated from the marker, if they had opposed it, then from where had they truly come? No, what he had felt upon touching the marker was not love. It was utter, absolute indifference to the human race. Humanity was merely a means to an end. He wondered whether, by giving the marker what it wanted, he had unknowingly made things far worse for humanity. Altman finally told Harmon that they needed to reach the command center, that there was something he had to do before they could leave. The control chamber was untouched and empty, likely because the marker rested directly above it. Altman approached the main terminal and found what he needed. The display announced, "Flooding procedure will begin in 10 minutes." Harmon shouted in panic, demanding to know what Altman had done, but the countdown had already begun. When Harmon asked why, Altman lied, claiming it was necessary to protect the marker, that it had belonged safely below for a reason, and that this was what had to be done. Pressure was already changing throughout the station. As Altman stepped into the corridor, he saw a thin line of water trickling down one wall. The process had begun slowly, but was now irreversible. He told Harmon that they would swim out through the submarine bay, that once the doors opened, Harmon was to swim up as fast as he could, following the rope to the surface where a moored boat awaited. Altman promised he would be right behind him. Wide-eyed, Harmon nodded. When Altman finally broke the surface, his lungs burned as though they had caught fire. He and Harmon hauled themselves into the boat. The vessel spun violently in the whirlpool formed by the collapsing facility, and it took every ounce of Altman's strength to break free of the churning water and steer toward the shore. As they moved toward land, Harmon remarked that Altman had lied, insisting that the marker had never wished to be submerged, and accusing Altman not of reverence, but of hatred. Before Altman could react, Harmon struck him across the head with something heavy. Dazed, Altman felt Harmon seize his arms and begin binding them together. Harmon announced that he intended to seek real help, stood up, and stepped toward the boat's control panel. Altman lay motionless, vision dimming, warm blood running down his cheek. When he opened his eyes again, Krax, Markov, and Stevens stood before him. Krax informed him that he was impressed Altman had survived and explained that Harmon had told them everything. They demanded to know why Altman had drowned the marker. Altman, barely able to speak, answered that it had been dangerous. Krax countered that it was not dangerous, but sacred. Markov claimed that the marker had created life, insisting he had witnessed it reanimate dead flesh with his own eyes. Stevens added that all evidence suggested the marker had shaped life on Earth millennia ago, and that once they acquired a fully functional marker, humanity would evolve beyond mortal limits toward eternal life. Stevens explained that Harmon had revealed Altman's discoveries, that the marker desired to reproduce, that it was broken and aware of its condition, and that it needed them to remake it so it could aid humanity. He assured Altman that they would not merely rebuild it, they would perfect its technology, create a marker that functioned flawlessly, and then improve upon it further. Altman noticed the fanatical gleam in Stevens's eyes as he leaned closer. A moment later, he felt another injection, and the world dissolved into darkness. Altman awoke again. The room around him was white and featureless, offering no sense of orientation or comfort. High above, beyond reach, a surveillance camera stared down at him. In one corner stood a small toilet. Beside it, an automated food dispenser. Hours passed, then days. Eventually, the dead began to return, one by one, gathering around him to keep him company. Everyone whose death he felt responsible for appeared and sat in silent judgment. Ada, Field, Hendricks, Hammond, and others he could no longer recognize. There was nothing left but him, his guilt, and the dead. Then he awoke once more, and found that he was no longer in that room. Instead, he was seated in a chair at a long table, his wrists locked to the armrests with restraints. Across from him sat Markov and Stevens. Markov greeted him, and Altman told them they were not real, that they were hallucinations. Stevens insisted that they were present, and added that even if they were not, there would be no harm in speaking with them. Markov claimed that Altman had interfered with their experiments, destroyed property on an enormous scale, and done everything in his power to hinder them. After the incident at the floating facility, Markov had assumed the creatures would tear Altman apart and remake him into one of their own, and that he would watch the spectacle from home with a bowl of popcorn. But even that had failed. Instead, Altman had sunk a research installation worth billions. Markov declared that he intended Altman's death to be something extraordinary. Altman replied that both men were insane. Markov asked if he wished to hear their plans, but Altman refused and told them to send him back to his cell. Ignoring him, Markov explained that once they unlocked the marker's secrets and reconstructed a new one, they would share it with the public. Since the matter concerned the salvation of humankind, they needed to spread their faith, and the best way to do so would be to establish an official religion. A smile crept across Markov's face as he explained that once they were done with Altman, his brief stunt with the press would not harm their cause. Instead, he would become a saint. Altman, he said, had been the first to reveal the marker to the world, the one who had begun it all. People would believe he had founded the religion himself. Stevens added that, like any prophet, Altman would be more useful dead than alive. Once he died, they could allow their version of the truth to grow unopposed around his name. They would write stories and scriptures about him, and his name would forever be tied to the Church of Unitology. Markov added that this would allow them to remain hidden while pursuing their goals, and that he found it deeply satisfying to imagine Altman's name leading a movement he had tried so desperately to destroy. Markov then declared that Altman had become expendable, and that they had decided to offer his body to science, arranging for him a particularly horrifying death. Stevens noted that they had created a specimen, a creature constructed from the remains of 3 human corpses, and that they were eager for Altman to meet it. Markov assured Altman they would not throw him in defenseless. He reached into his pocket, produced a spoon, and forced it into Altman's hand, wishing him luck. They threw him into a chamber roughly 6 meters across, circular and bare. Above, through reinforced glass, Markov and Stevens watched him, sipping champagne and smiling. Altman thought that the world was a kind of hell. One could do everything right, cheat death itself, and yet destroy everything with a single misstep. Those, it seemed, were the terms of his existence. A door beside him slid open, and a creature dragged itself into the chamber. Altman prayed silently that it was a hallucination. He shut his eyes and opened them again. The creature remained. It roared and lunged toward him. Thank you for watching till the end. Just a quick reminder, my channel is just a couple of months old, and every like and subscription means the world and helps it grow.